Thank you everyone for being here. Today I'll be moderating this conversation between faculty from the New Schools Department of Economics. There will be a few rules. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to discuss their viewpoints on the election, at which I will be keeping time, 2 minutes. I'll give a signal at time. And then there will be 1 minute rebuttals. This will all happen in the order of Professor Dos Santos, Professor Ghilarducci, and Professor Reddy. Okay, great. Okay, we'll do it. We'll just do it from backwards. Okay. Professor Ghilarducci, yeah, okay, yes, whenever you're ready.
Teresa Ghilarducci, and I'm a professor of economics here at the New School. I'm going to talk about three major economic effects of the election or the election outcome. Let me get taxes over with. The Trump 2017 tax cuts, it was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, will expire at the end of 2025. And at that time, taxes will increase by $4 trillion. The tax cut of 2017 had promised to spur economic growth, but the tax cut was top heavy. The vast majority of those tax cuts was enjoyed by the very top income groups, the incidence and the direct tax effects. It starved the government of revenue, and it did not create jobs independently. Households in the top 1% saw an average tax cut exceeding $60,000 per year, while the bottom 60% of households received less than $500. The tax cuts of 2017 created a gap in tax revenue of $2.5 trillion, and that is in, how big is the U.S. economy, everybody? Actually 25, it's $25 trillion, so 10% of GDP was lost in tax revenues. The Trump tax cuts helped reduce government share in the whole economy from 19% all the way down to 16%, one of the lowest shares of OECD. And that reduces the fiscal space to spend more on public goods. Research also showed that corporations benefiting from the cuts did not create jobs. They only increased executive pay. If Trump wins, he promises to push for extending these tax cuts, which are highly tilted towards the rich, as I said. But he'll also cut taxes on tips and on Social Security income. Now that sounds good, except the incidence of that tax cut will fall squarely on Social Security, hastening its insolvency to 2031, not 2034, which at that time, the average benefit, which is $1,200 per month, will be cut by a third automatically. In contrast, Harris would let most of these tax cuts would actually impose more tax cuts on the rich, would not let those parts of the tax bill expire, but still cut taxes for households under 400,000. Both candidates are not terribly concerned about the federal deficit, and both of them are right. You should not be concerned about the deficit. As a New School economist Robert Heilbronner argued, the consideration is not the size of the deficit or the existence of the deficit. It's rather how government spends its money and who pays for it. So 1 minute on tariffs. You might all know that Trump proposes a 10% tariff on all imported goods and a 60% tariff on all goods imported from China. That's unprecedented in modern trade. This is not an Alexander Hamilton or even a George Biden kind of targeted tariff meant to protect infant industries like solar panel industry. This is a non-targeted across-the-board tariffs. Advocates are unions in some places that have been severely affected by imports and places in the country that are now quite poor and downwardly mobile that have been affected by the China shock. But the tariffs on imports will not protect those areas or those jobs because imports are not substitutes for domestically produced goods. They are often complements. And the increase in the goods will be passed on to consumers. But I'm going to spend the bulk of my time on a major issue in the election that is not seen to be an economic issue, but it is. And that is access to abortion rights. I was one of the 124 economists that joined an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the case of Dobbs v. Jackson Health Clinic. And we argued in that amicus to the court that abortion access and access to family planning and contraception had helped increase the economic emergence of women. Restricting abortion would severely affect women's economic rights, and not all women, but a very particular group of women. In a natural experiment called the Turnaway Study, it compared two groups of women who were seeking abortions. One group got the abortion, the other group was turned away because she did not meet a gestational limit. She was just maybe days over that limit. The women who got the abortion they sought and the women who didn't get the abortion were compared. There are 6 major economic outcomes from that study and others. First, the women who were denied abortion faced immediate financial hardship. They were already struggling financially. 75% of women who seek abortions are low income, and nearly half live below the poverty line. Having an unwanted baby causes health problems and lost work time. And abortion denials resulted in greater parental obligation, but there was no evidence that they got any more income support from a family member, from the male partner, or from the government. Second, abortion and birth control in the past has enabled women to pursue education. It reduced teenage pregnancy, the access to abortion and family planning, and it increased college attendance among women. Independent effect. 3, birth control and abortion access increased women's labor supply. That was an independent effect as well. 4th, there is a well-documented large and persistent decline in earnings for women right after they have a baby. That's called the famous mother penalty. We so far have not found any evidence that there's a father penalty. Last, restricting abortion disproportionately affects Blacks and Hispanic women. Restricting abortion increases racial disparities. Most pregnant people who want an abortion are already parents. The most cited reason for having an abortion, wanting an abortion, is to take better care of their existing children and to avoid financial distress. So abortion access, or the lack of it, has intergenerational consequences. To sum up, the 2024 presidential election carries significant economic implications, from taxes to tariffs and to women's rights.
Good evening, everyone. Let me thank Teresa, first of all, for organizing this event. It was her idea, and I think a very good one, as part of our effort to educate ourselves, as well as perhaps engage in a larger conversation about issues that matter in the contemporary world, and not just undertake abstract theorizing and the like. Also like to thank Michael, who is one of our star undergraduates, and it was Teresa's, again, excellent idea to have an undergraduate moderate today's panel. Michael is a debater, which you might have realized from the fact that he said that we would each have 1 minute for rebuttal, which I don't propose to use. At least I don't have anything to rebut in what Teresa has said. But getting to the point, I think Teresa has already laid out a lot of the specific issues which might be of interest to voters. But I'd like to take a step back and look at the problem from a longer term point of view. And I suspect I won't be alone in doing that. So let me start by saying, once upon a time, there was a thing called neoliberalism. And people have debated exactly how to define it, maybe ad nauseum. So I won't get into that debate. I'm going to assume we each have some kind of working definition for neoliberalism, and that these definitions are somewhat overlapping. And if we don't like the term neoliberalism, we have another term for that set of economic policies which was um, dominant in the period between, let us say, the early 1980s and 2008, which became ascendant, more and more ascendant in a number of countries in the world and eventually dominant. And this set of policies, as you know, included quite a number of things that nowadays no longer seem to be on the agenda. For example, free trade. That's one of many elements of that earlier agenda which do not seem to be at the core of today's proposals from either side. The Biden administration has maintained a number of the tariffs that were introduced by Trump in his period as president. So if we were to ask the question, for example, so if we were to ask the question, what is this new set of commitments, this new set of ideas, which has supplanted those of neoliberalism, if there is a new set of ideas, we might, I think, have some difficulty because there are elements of continuity and there are elements of clear-cut discontinuity. Trump, for example, famously, as we know, again, likes tariffs, but he also dislikes taxes, which is another hallmark of neoliberalism. So what shall we call it? Now, you all know, those of you who've studied in our department, I'm sure, the famous phrase used by Joan Robinson to refer to the neoclassical synthesis, as it was called, the American representation of Keynesian ideas, and that was bastard Keynesianism. One of the thoughts that I've experimented with in the years since Trump was elected president first is that we should think about Trump's favored policies as bastard neoliberalism. The neoclassical synthesis, at least, was a coherent set of ideas, which Robinson was, of course, viewing as involving a misrepresentation of or a deviation from the true spirit of Keynesianism. Whether bastard neoliberalism is even a coherent set of ideas, I think is open to question. But in some sense, the old world has yet to die, the new world has yet to be born. We're having a lot of difficulties in making sense of this, theoretically. As they say, you know, all know that joke about economists. It works in practice, but does it work in theory, right? So we have to figure out how to make sense of this. Now, there are a lot of debates, as you know, as to what's going to happen as a result of one or another candidate winning in terms of interest rates, in terms of exchange rates, and so on. Apparently, there are people on Wall Street who are engaging in what they call a Trump trade. So they have different interpretations of exactly what that is, as to whether exchange rates will go down or go up, interest rates will go down or go up. But from a very long run point of view, one of the US's strengths has been its entrenched institutions, right? And institutions that stand for certain things, that protect certain things, for good or for ill. The US has been the champion of globalization. The US for a very long time has been able to sustain its geopolitical relationships and to maintain the support of its allies through strong trading ties, among other things. The US dollar's, of course, centrality in world payments is a very important part of that glue as well. So we have to ask the question, it seems to me, would a Trump victory, if it happens as some of the prediction markets and so on are at least suggesting might happen, would it lead to a deinstitutionalization of these core elements in the US economy in ways that would eventually have long-term significance? And there are many different elements of this. One of them, which has been discussed, is, of course, the independence of the Federal Reserve. Now, not all of us are great enthusiasts of central bank independence. Right? We see a case for democracies to have more of a governance role with respect to central banks than oftentimes they do. But certainly, if one is interested in the long-term role of the US dollar in the world system, if one were interested in that, one would want to have a set of institutional safeguards for that, whatever those might be. So to the extent that this is a set of policies which is certainly very pro-private property, especially plutocratic private property, but not necessarily pro-institutions as we normally understand the term. This may, it seems to me, have some potential long-term implications with respect to how attractive the United States is as a destination for foreign capital flows, for example, on which the US is likely to continue to have to rely maybe more under Trump administration because of the increased borrowing which would be required. But all of this is speculation, right? The end of the US dollar has been proclaimed far too many times. And I think one of the bets that is being made, certainly in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, is that US technological supremacy is part of what will safeguard US economic dominance and political dominance for decades to come. Right? And that might well be true, even in the midst of some of the deinstitutionalization which a Trump victory could portend. I'm sure I'm running out of time. 2 minutes, okay. So let me just briefly also raise one or two other questions. One of the things that used to puzzle me is which sectors in the United States, which economic sectors or industries favor Trump? And way back before 2016, that wasn't completely obvious. Now it's becoming clearer. There's a little bit more of a pattern that's emerging because a lot of people are coming out of the woodwork and they're no longer embarrassed to support Trump, it seems. One of the things that I've been very intrigued by is that the finance sector has come out swinging in favor of Trump, it seems to me, even though there are residual elements of the finance sector that are still very much in favor of the Democratic Party. Or maybe they're splitting their bets, but certainly there's much greater support from mainstream figures in finance and financial institutions, implicit or explicit, for Trump. So it turns out that manufacturing industries have been big supporters of Trump as well. Not surprisingly, that is somewhat more predictable. Energy, of course, because of Trump's support for fracking and other policies that are likely to benefit energy-related interests, especially in related to petrochemicals as opposed to green energy. Defense, less clear because of the fact that Trump is actually, interestingly, not as enthusiastic about certain foreign military adventures as the Democratic Party appears to be, at least in its mainstream. So some of the boom that's been experienced by defense contractors since the war in Ukraine began and has been bolstered by additional wars elsewhere and perceived risk in West Asia, in the Middle East as well. Might or might not be favored by Trump. So anyway, these are some considerations. There's a lot else to talk about, but I think that that making sense of what's happening is not so straightforward. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, I wanted also to thank Teresa for the invitation. I normally spend this time working on probability, price, or value theory by myself. Being around people talking about these things is salutary. It forces me to flex some brain muscles that I flex at home, but not in public very often. And I deeply appreciate the opportunity to do this. Teresa, as somebody who will tend to emphasize in their discussion today similarities between the two candidates, I really wanted to thank you for the centrality of abortion rights to what you had to say, because as I look over at the horizon, that is the one distinguishing issue that matters to people, that can be life and death, not only economic loss, but literally life and death across the country. And I just wanted to say that. Now, taking a step back, I'm not going to make any claim of originality in what I'm going to say. Most of this, if not all, has been said already by other people, probably better. I have no doubt that if this proves to be correct, it will be said again in the future in very Wallrasian terms that will be very amenable to the individualist and colonialist prejudices of the profession, and people will get prizes for it. Hope somebody got that one. Tough crowd. Correct. Like Sanjay, I'm trying to take a step back, and there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between what I have to say and what Sanjay said. I will be a little bit more negative, I guess, overall. It's funny inversion here, but that's what happens. I want to invite everybody to think, who am I to advise anybody to vote in any way, shape, or form? I have the luxury of having more time than most people do to think about things. So I feel like I have a responsibility just to churn out what I come up with. Okay, so take it in that spirit. And I think, like Sanjay, that it is crucial to take a step back in thinking about this election and think about a global context. The issue of climate change and the planetary crisis that we're facing comes to mind. I will hopefully be able to return to it towards the end of my remarks. But then there's this issue that it's become very clear to me that to understand anything in the current period, we need to understand that we are at a very particular socio-political international juncture. We are at the end of the post-Cold War period. We are at the end of the post-Soviet period. We are at the end of history. That period has run its course. And everything in this election can be very helpfully understood against that background. This period, since the end of the Cold War, was a period of uncontested US hegemony, a period of monumental strides in the internationalization of trade, of finance, and of production lines. This is new in the history of capitalism. And it was, of course, as Sanjay noted, the period of the discourse of free trade, free markets. At most, governments are supposed to do market complementing interventions to make sure that it all doesn't go wrong. But fundamentally, in looking at this through my IR groupie status, I can explain when and where exactly I became an IR groupie. That's a whole other story. A period where the imperial project, such as it was, if we're going to call it, was one of promoting a US-led international liberal order around free trade, free investment, free finance, and production. Now, there were two factors as people embarked on this project that shaped where we. One of them is the role of the dollar. We ended up with integration and the creation of an international system with a fundamental asymmetry at its core. And the centrality of the dollar and the appetite for dollar holdings as reserve holdings out there created pressures that greatly unbalanced the world economy in ways that we had not seen before. The United States was able to sustain trade deficits that it would not otherwise have been able to sustain. This creates a particular political configuration here that needs to be grappled with. The United States rapidly became the consumer of last resort, as other people have said. And the financial sector grew disproportionately to the point, some of us would argue, of a real measure of hypertrophy within not only the US economy, but within the United States political economy. And of course, we have China. And we have a very different set of institutions that have a capacity to stand above, apparently, the traditional economic interests. They have had capital account controls and have been able to implement strategic industrial policy in a variety of new and creative ways to great effect. That combination, to my mind, obviously there's many other factors, shaped everything that happened. And what happened is momentous. And it bears thinking about. We have seen the most rapid and significant geographic configuration of production in the history of the species. We have unprecedented measures of international supply chain, trade, and financial interdependence developing in this period. We have observed the wholesale, or at least partial destruction of entire historical industrial sectors, areas, and communities across the United States and Europe. This is crucial. A deep sense in those communities that they have been left behind We have an entire vocabulary and polite conversation among fine professional people such as ourselves to hide these realities. The flyover states, the Rust Belts, the inner city. We have all sorts of ways we have created in our discourse to hide these realities. You've had the rise of China as a global industrial powerhouse, and with that rise dragging a number of other regions alongside with it in very positive and transformative ways. And this is the second pillar that's fundamental, the rise of China as a geopolitical player, as a potential contestant of US hegemony, potentially at the head of a push for a more multilateral approach to international governance. So we're in a period where the parts of this we recognize. We should remember what happened when Britain faced the United States and Germany as rising powers. But it's different now, and it's different because of the interdependencies. Chimerica, I think, was the term that Ferguson put. I don't like to quote him approvingly, but he was putting his finger on something. How much time do I have? All of that. So let me break it down, because I have political observations. I'm going to focus on the economic, having said a bunch of political things. Both of the major parties in the United States are articulating an economic vision that effectively pursues the same set of objectives within that context of decline. There are some important variations, but they are both pursuing a political alliance in different ways between these sectors that have been hitherto disenfranchised and marginalized and left behind on the one hand, and a perspective in the economic policy sphere that represents a very significant retreat from internationalism into nationalism and protectionism in the first instance. And in its worst incarnation, and you see this most clearly in the Harris campaign's documents, into a militarized industrial policy that seeks to identify the longing of ordinary people in this country for a secure livelihood with excelling in the industries that are going to guarantee military and political supremacy of a particular state. And that's poison for progressive politics. The most interesting thing, obviously there's differences, right? Trump puts the tariffs. Biden doesn't take him down. Biden has his people do policy papers. They go to the Pentagon, give speeches to the Brookings. They go to foreign affairs, write thought pieces. Trump has concepts of a plan. And then Peter Navarro, who promises that the second order effects of the tariffs are coming. They're coming. So there is an IQ issue involved here that I don't want to. But the irony of it is that this retreat into the national for the United States will not work. Sorry. The other thing that they all agree, by the way, is ongoing fiscal profligacy. Okay, the Latin word, I should be able to say it. For a country that has a chronic current account deficit. So in many ways, attempting to export to the rest of the world the incapacity of this polity to knock heads to pursue what it wants to pursue. It's a fleecing of the world, if people are with me, yeah? The thing is that the retreat to the national, I don't think will work, and it will certainly not work in the terms that it's being proposed. Because actually, the American economy right now bears the marks of the imbalances that grew out of its placement at the center in ways that you cannot escape even within a generation. And there are many aspects to it, and I'm just going to say both and then I'll conclude. One of them is that I am increasingly of the view that in this country, nothing significant can be achieved economically by government of private sector unless it fundamentally and grotesquely enriches somebody who is making campaign contributions to the politician in charge. We used to speak of this in political science as particularistic capture. It speaks to a hollowing out of institutions. So in carrying out that retooling that is necessary, there may not be the bureaucratic capacity to do so. Two, and this is just a little anecdote that comes from my children, my boys, who are American. There's other things too. But surveys carried out in China and other places in East Asia ask children what they want to be when they grow up. And what they get are the kinds of answers that I gave when I was a kid. I suspect you both gave when you were children in different contexts. You want to be a scientist, an engineer. Some of us wanted to be mathematicians, but it's in that doctors. You ask children in the United States right now what they want to be, and they want to be YouTubers. And by the time they go to college, they want to go into finance. Same problem. My sense, and as somebody who's now staring at the reality that I am deeply in the middle of middle age, that the path to wisdom and equity for the United States polity is to embrace its decline, to recognize that the solutions to the problems that we face are not national. We're facing planetary problems, not just with climate, but how do you configure an industrial structure that can provide meaningful and stable livelihoods for the majority of people in a complementary way? There is a space here for the left to reclaim this mantle of international liberalism that is being abandoned. And I would urge all of us to give it a think about how to turn it into both policy but also political advocacy reality. Thank you.
Thank you to all. Yeah, so we're just going to move on to 1-minute responses in the same order that we started.
Let me lift up some areas where the three of us agree. We both agree that the two candidates are quite similar in their economic viewpoint. Both have embraced a bastard liberalism. I really like that, Sanjay. Thank you. Both want some tax cuts. Trump wants very large and very regressive tax cuts. Harris wants smaller tax cuts and much more progressive. Both candidates really don't care about the deficit. Cutting the deficit is not part of the campaign, and it was ever since Obama. Trump broke from that. Both will embrace tariffs, one large, one small, one broad, one targeted. We didn't talk about migration. One candidate has very cruel migration and immigration policies. The other, not so cruel, but not all that different. Both are moving away from neoliberalism, but both want to protect private property. It's central to their economic vision. The two are very different in these two regards. One candidate does not envision lifting up most Americans' economic security. Their fiscal policies, where they want to spend money, what they view as public goods are very, very different. Harris is absolutely in the center of where the Democratic Party is, where the Biden administration is, and that's a New Deal-ish idea that the wealth of the nation comes from the security of the workers and their households. The other candidate absolutely does not. The other place that they're very different, and I'm just going to say it, is the access to human rights. The access to men and women to plan their own families, which have very important knockoff effects, economic knockoff effects. They couldn't be more different. And we haven't talked about political or human rights differences either.
Thanks very much, Michael. And I agree with everything Teresa said. Very helpful and specific again. I was, as always, impressed by the eloquence and the moral sensibility of Paulo. And I want to just echo some of the things that he said, which are very, very important. I think many aspects of the outperformance of the American economy in the last decades and the high level of living standards of Americans have to do with, as he put it, the centrality of the United States in the post-war international economic order. And inevitably, that has been fraying and will continue to fray. A multipolar system is emerging politically, and in some respects, it is emerging economically. And I think that the bet that's being made, again, by the Silicon Valley tech billionaires, that's another sector which is to a considerable extent supporting Trump, is that American supremacy in new technological areas will forestall that. But that's going to also be a plutocratic solution. It's not likely to further the interests of the vast majority, to use a phrase that some people in our department have used in the United States or in other countries. So I think the emphasis that Paulo has put on a new multilateralism, so to speak, looking for new kinds of new visions of international order which can support the inclusion of the vast majority is very, very important. And I think the Democratic Party has really fallen down here in its focus on some of the old and hackneyed forms of international cooperation, which are also tied in with militarism. The idea that there's a contrast between the Democrats and Republicans under Trump in relation to NATO, for instance, which is surely true. But beyond NATO, can we think about, to coin a phrase, MITO, the Multilateral Inclusion Treaty Organization? What will that look like in the future? Right? What kinds of cooperation? What visions of trade, capital integration, and so forth, which would support employment, support inclusion of the vast majority, social and economic inclusion can be thought about which we have some ideas, but I've run out of time.
I don't have very much to add. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Like I said, I feel very self-conscious that I emphasized the similarities. This is not to say that there aren't important differences. Wherever I may land as a conclusion, this kind of besides the point. On the issue of reproductive rights, though, I do have to say that I wish that the Democratic Party would move beyond just campaigning on the issue, but enshrining it into law. See, in Latin America, we have an expression. You've heard me do this thing before, right? There's this very, people refer to when there is an improvement in the church, they're building something new in the church, and that never ends. They're building a new tower or something, and then it never ends because that's how you fundraise. And abortion became that for the Democratic Party, throwing at people the most unpalatable neoliberal candidates, but then dangling the very important and life and death question of access to abortion as the reason to compel people, despite their deep aversion, to vote for them. And the terrible aspect of that position is that there's no out, other than, of course, having a credible electoral alternative. And that's, anyway, I'll stop there. I have more things to say about more narrowly economic and broader, but it's great to be here. I had the realization the other day, great minds don't think alike. That's what makes them great. Minds that think alike probably ain't that great. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you.
Right. Okay. Really, really close. So now I think we will open up to questions. Personally, I think we'll have 3 from whoever's here and then 3 from online, if anyone's online. Yeah? Okay. 3 in person and then 3 online. They will, but based on whoever has. It starts now, so you have questions. Yeah?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for doing this. Making 2 sort of warnings first. I'm someone who doesn't vote here, not even a permanent resident, so that doesn't affect me as much. I shouldn't be speaking that much, but I'll try to. The second one is that sometimes I find myself in a certain nostalgia. I'm someone who was born in the post-Cold War era, and I have a certain nostalgia for the era that I haven't lived. And it's funny that we're going, in a sense, back. I have several remarks, starting from the easier one, which is the whole rights, human rights, civil rights thing. I think it's a much broader issue. When the Roe versus Wade was overturned, there was a list of issues leaked to the media. I don't remember by who, but who justice it was. And there were several issues there. The Miranda rights were there, the LGBTQ rights were there, the workers' rights were there. So this is a much wider problem. And I think at some point is beyond just a presidential election, in the sense that if the institutions in the United States remain as they are, this is always a caveat. The second point, which is kind of contrasting, and this is again a weird point because it comes mainly from a European perspective where the left-right division is different. I'm not sure to which extent the left, or quote unquote left, say the Democratic Party here, though I don't think there's an equivalence of a one-to-one relation anyway, can still fight politically by supporting merely a rights versus non-rights discussion. And it's a great bitter from someone who is better read than dead, to see the left falling for that instead of the families, workers, lower income people, as it used to be in the past, and seeing the right and far right people taking those slogans over. Another remark, which all of you pointed out, I think that the geopolitical chessboard is changing fast. And again, it's a good question whether elections here can change that. We are moving to an era where dollar will not be a reserve for many countries. Gold is coming back for many of them. China, India, Russia, Turkey, they're moving there. So it's a good question to what extent the US can think themselves maybe not being the first player in such a world. Maybe not now, obviously. It will take several years if that ever happens. But a contingency plan is necessary, and the contingency plan also needs to think deindustrialization, financialization, secular stagnation problems, and issues like this, with all the industries that were mentioned faced or still face at some point. I'll stop here. Thank you very much again.
I'll take a couple and then let the panel respond.
Hi, my name is Jun Han. I'm research student in South London University. I'm a little bit curious because your three panel talk about some kind of domestic issue. My question is about what do you think about two presidential candidates foreign affair policy? Because there are two industry that two pillars support the U.S. market. U.S. financial market, and the one is innovate-based, the IT industry, like Google, Apple. Nowadays, AI, right? There another industry related with petrol oil and industry that relate with military conflicts. Then now, from the 2002, we live in this military Keynesian era, and then they have a plan. In the global, there were three areas they want to perform their business model. I'm not want to talk about global peace or something. I want to ask your American intellectual fully understand there are some systemic error in this model. Like United States, there are no more, how can I say, military superiority. Military superiority means the weapon system that United States have is not superior anymore. For example, the final solution will be nuclear war, right? If you Google what is hypersonic missile system, which China, Russia, even North Korea have, your country do not have even defense system, and until now, they fail to produce, such a, how can I say, new type of ICBM. If okay, in this business model, there are some assumption that all this war or struggle supposed to controllable. if you know this fact, it is not controllable. Okay, still Putin and the Xi Jinping, they are nice because they're waiting the result of this election. My question is, what do you think about the two presidential candidates, foreign affair policy?
Thank you. Very brief question. I just wanted to push you a bit on this point of, is there consensus or not? So I myself now interested in the question, how did the transition from Keynesianism, sort of the Keynesian consensus, to the neoliberal consensus, so to speak, happen? And what is really striking is that it was kind of a cross-party consensus, and not just in the United States, but in many Western countries, which I'm most familiar with, and I'm sure also this had ramifications in the rest of the world. So I wondered whether you think we are witnessing the emergence of a new consensus, or whether there's really too much like disagreement or in conflict at the moment.
You asked how we moved from Keynesianism to a neoliberalism. I really put it squarely in the decline of unions that happened in the 1970s. Lots of reasons and political fight and struggle and violence towards workers. 1981, that dovetailed. So that meant that the working class stopped being aligned with the Democratic Party. And we're now seeing this strange aspect that Nikos talked about, is that the Trump is a kind of a bastard populism in pretending to support the problems of areas of the country that have been hit by the China shock. The other part of it was what we call the Washington Consensus, was a worldwide embracing of a framework for global management that came from Washington-based institutions like the World Bank or IMF. All this happening in the early 80s.
Thank you. Very rich questions. Nikos, I'm not one of those who thinks that the US dollar's role is going to diminish quickly. I think that it's diminishing glacially. So I think you're right that there's a shift that's taking place in terms of central banks' reserve composition and so on. But there are also some reasons to think that its role will continue for quite a long time, just as happened in the case of pound sterling, for instance, for over long historical periods, of course, with various and mounting challenges. So yes, we may be at an inflection point. I think that the deinstitutionalization of the United States under a Trump presidency would very much mark such an inflection point, but there would be a long trajectory thereafter, I think, in such a storyline. On the second question on foreign affairs, this is a very difficult issue for mere economists to think about, but I think that we are in a situation of mutual assured destruction, multilateral mutual assured destruction, for the reasons that you mentioned. It's not only hypersonic ICBMs, but it's it's cheap swarms of drones, and it's battlefield robots, and it's facial recognition, and it's a bunch of other things. So and it's, as you say, not a preserve of one or two countries anymore. We're already seeing that in the conflict in Ukraine. So basically, I think that to the extent the US has relied on its military superiority as a key pillar of its economic strategy, that is going to be increasingly difficult for the reasons you mentioned. The inability of Russia to achieve battlefield supremacy against asymmetric warfare involving drones, right? That its tanks are not a match for Ukraine's ability to produce large numbers of drones, is an example of the kinds of challenges that will will surely emerge, and it has some kind of, it will have a connection to the ability of the US to maintain its economic role in the world. Now, if the US makes certain kinds of errors, that will compound the problem, right? I understand that according to the US national security strategy, the US is supposed to be able to fight 2 or is it 3 regional wars simultaneously. Well, you know, if you pick the wrong regional wars and unnecessary wars, you'll quickly end up in a situation where your resources are so stretched you're not able to do that, which will affect confidence, which will have economic implications. And then finally on Rex, how does one consensus shift and another emerge? And is there a new consensus that's emerging? Well, very interesting. I think on the political front, yes. You know, Steve Bannon et al. Have been busy developing their confederation of illiberal majoritarian countries. And they've been quite successful at that. That's why they love to praise Viktor Orban. If you want to amuse yourself, look up the memes on Narendra Modi and Giorgia Meloni hugging. Yeah, plentiful internet memes on that. Some were based on 1 or 2 real photographs, I think. But there's an adding up problem when it comes to the economic aspect. You know, to what is their policy? What is their approach to national economic prosperity? At least under the post-Second World War U.S.-led global order, we could understand certain elements that were supposed to contribute to shared prosperity. What is that in this case? I don't think they have an answer.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, okay. On new consensus, I agree with what was just said, ×2. Thank you. There's a very interesting article in Phenomenal World, and I forget the name of the author, and I have to apologize. But the article chronicles the evolution of the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the Biden programs early on, and this relates to your question. See, consensus a set of ideas can help maintain cohesion in a particular socio-political economic dispensation only for so long. At some point, the contradictions of the system go beyond the capacity of the discourse to hold the whole thing together. But there is no new discourse there just waiting. It doesn't come out of a smoke-filled room. The 1970s in the United States were in many ways a period where they hadn't figured out what is this new system where the dollar is no longer convertible? How do we manage it? How do we attain nominal stability? What's the labor capital bargain in that setting, and so on? What's our balance of payments going to look like? It took until Volcker in the early 80s and the defeats of labor to chart. Very sorry. Very sorry. I think we're in a similar period. And in those periods, it seems to me that anticipating evolutionary processes is the way to go. Different things are going to be tried. The thing about the Phenomenal World article is that it shows how actually people like Heather and others came to the table with all sorts of things that I think most of us would support. But what survived at the other end of the sausage making was Lockheed Martin, semiconductors, and everything that's going to help us bomb the crap out of China. And I say us as a figure of speech. I am neither an American nor an intellectual, so I resent the term. Some people may disagree. Please disagree. It would do great. I will avoid some therapy. So, but consensus do emerge. And my concern is that we're seeing the contours exactly of what Sanjay said, of a retreat to the national. And illiberalism, not only in the economic sphere, but also in the political sphere and the cultural sphere. I think that's a great loss of opportunity, to be perfectly honest, and a waste of humanity. That's the most charitable thing that I can say. That's one thing. Other thing is this. I keep thinking, people know who Carl Sagan was? A great red diaper baby who carried a deeply infused sense of Marxism, even though he was never an open Marxist in any way, shape, or form. But there's a speech that he gives, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, and he says that he fears for a future in the United States where the US economy no longer makes stuff. And why does he worry about this? Because in either science or engineering or in manufacturing, success is tested by reality every day. It inserts a certain discipline in thought. So not only do you have the technological and industrial prowess, you also have the intellectual habits and the institutional modalities to deal with facts. And as an outside observer who lives here, is raising their family here. When I look at the US polity, economy, and culture, the thing that concerns me the most is exactly what Sagan was worried about. That when you turn to an economy that is no longer centered on actually having to deal with reality, you wake up one day in an economy where what guarantees success is sycophancy, being on message, and saying what everybody else wants you to be saying. And that's not reality. So we should not be surprised then, as we look at what the candidates are putting forward in terms of geopolitical strategy, that you get hubris. You get proposals that are unlikely to work because they presume the world is just going to sit there and not do anything. Yes, you can put an embargo on China on microchips. Guess what's going to happen? People with me here? And I'll conclude with this, because in my really salty days, I think that everything went wrong with Calvinism. And the notions of individualism and of acquisitiveness that went with it. It had its progressive moment. Maybe the problem is not capitalism. And this notion that outside of our agency and our efforts to prove our worth to God through our worldly deeds, there is a presumption that there is a passive world out there that is for the taking or that warrants no concern with. That doesn't work, because there are other agents. There are other countries, there are other nations, there are other constituencies out there that have just as much a right to have an equal say in how this world is governed economically and politically as anybody here does. And I will continue, since I am here, not in this meeting, but in this country, to advocate in here for the sooner the United States polity realizes that it's as bad, good, and ugly as everybody else, and has to resolve its internal political conflicts like everybody else, sometimes by taxing the crap out of somebody. That it cannot be Oprah, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. And the cars keep coming from ships that some workers somewhere else are toiling at I don't know how many dollars an hour to make. The sooner we're going to actually be able to pursue sustainable avenues of action for ordinary people in this country.
Take a last set of questions from online.
I have two questions online. I'll read them in order. Yeah. One is from Nidhi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They say, a question to the panelists, including Paulo. Any opinion on the recent BRICS summit in Kazan? Does it portend a move away from the dollar globally? Any significance for US hegemony? A second question from Karthik. A question to the panelists as a whole. How do you see heterodox economics as a subfield within the United States surviving either candidate's presidency? It feels like, especially within the context of the retreats to the national unit, both candidates have either implemented or stated an intent to implement policies that feel like they narrow the space for truly radical economic thinking, especially within universities.
Your last chance.
Thank you. So since I think the Clinton years, we see this constant battle between the executive and Congress with the opposing party regarding you know the American bonds and whether or not to default, etc. And we're increasingly getting closer and closer to a situation that is catastrophic. Thus far, many people doubt and say this is just to play for the base. It will never happen, but it keeps getting closer and closer. So I wonder if you consider the possibility, especially once if you have Harris winning the executive and the Senate is most likely to go to the Republican Party. if if the Democratic administration is just going to be checkmated, and whether we're going to see this scenario finally come into fruition, or if not, if you know, wiser heads will prevail.
Hi. So I feel like most of what I've heard is about what their actual policies, economic policies are, which is great. That's what we should be talking about. But there's also the overwhelming impact of Americans' perceptions of the economy that's really rampant in this, elections cycle. And so, I guess I'm curious if if it reveals, this is kind of the other side, I guess, of Kartik's question, if it reveals ways that heterodox economists should be thinking about how we need to be producing more popular content to help people better understand how the economy works, what the possibilities are, and what is complete, fantasy.
Those were a lot of questions. I will take my moderator privilege to ask one final one, even if you don't answer it, which is just to echo the role of heterodox economics in building this new consensus. I hear no one really mentioned whether there would be any economic impacts of the continuing war in Gaza on the U.S. after this election. Whether there were any thoughts about that.
I'll go first because I don't want the final word, because I will end up giving a speech and calling for things, and we're going to storm some building, and we all know how that ends. Let me start with the difficult one. In thinking about this issue of fighting decline as an imperative for different forces in the United States, I had a rather sobering realization. You see, like many people looking at what's been happening in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon, and the US's continued support for those actions, I have found myself wondering, how can they continue to do this in the face of how it's moral content, but also from a more narrow perspective, given how it's being perceived across the world. But then my dark realization was that maybe there is an impetus, that it is precisely because they're carrying on in the face of worldwide opposition that it's being pursued as a statement. I'm not proposing this as a hypothesis. It's just the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. But it's very sobering. So that's one thing. The thing about the BRICS summit and about alternatives to the dollar, it reminds me of a joke that people would make, I think, in the 90s and early 90s. And the joke goes something like this: the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is not being exploited by capitalism. And there is something about, more broadly, hegemony that orders things. And you face that starkly when you start cogitating different hegemonies or counter-hegemonic projects. And you realize that hegemony does something that needs doing. It does other things that we don't want. So when I see things like Kazan, and basically I think that the weaknesses of the position of those of us who want something different gets exposed. Ditto for the dollar. Yes, there are many contradictions, but until there is a credible alternative, if we're living in market-based economies, unless there's a denomination for assets that internationally mobile wealth holders are willing to park their wealth in, that is an alternative, that is liquid and has access to where there are many markets, scopes for diversification, and so on par with the dollar. At least I cannot foresee how we could move to. People with me here? In other words, in the building of an alternative, you realize that there is something that the incumbent does that has to be grappled with. Heterodoxy, yes, I'm all for that. We should never give up. We should always see ourselves as a government in waiting. It takes a particular combination of patience and arrogance to carry on your whole life like that, but that built this department. And I think that we are going to be walking into a period where the notion that we can separate the economic sphere and be able to say something meaningful about distributional outcomes domestically, social policy, who's going to fund it, what are the taxation structures that are going to support all of that, independently of an awareness of what's happening globally, that's going to fray. And that is an opening. And there's different traditions that we can draw on. It can even be American institutionalism, for example. it can be IPE, it can be meso-level regulation. There's a number of tools that we here stand on and other colleagues out there stand on that I think can be particularly fruitful in contesting this space, and we should do it. And also, yes, I mean, the way people end up believing what they believe about how the economy works is something that I have a very hard time wrapping my head around. And perhaps nowhere more starkly right now than on the notion that the exporter pays the tariff. And that's out there. People actually believe that. But taxes are bad. And somehow that's the media. That's Jeff Bezos. That's the normalization of crazy that all major networks have pursued in this country. I'll stop there. But there's a lot, and I'm sorry that we didn't talk about the more granular things. But I do think that raising a warning about the macroscopic limits within which the granular things, what scopes we have, is useful.
Thank you very much, Paulo, and everyone. So first, on the question about the BRICS summit in Kazan, we know, Paulo and I, a thing or two about BRICS summits because we were authors of a report for a previous BRICS summit, an economic report, in which Paulo wrote an excellent chapter which laid out the case for an alternative monetary system. And we don't know to what extent that was actually behind the recent proposals that were made. Maybe it was percolating somehow, somewhere. But at any rate, one of the realities we learned in that exercise, I don't want to say too much so as not to be indiscreet, but it became very apparent that the BRICS are really China in the following sense. The New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so on and so forth. All of these are basically Chinese financed institutions. None of the other countries has the financial heft to really sustain those institutions adequately, right? So they're giving a multilateral gloss to it, and the BRICS have further expanded their membership recently, as you know. But it's really a question of whether China can currently support those institutions in a way that makes them meaningful bulwarks of an alternative institutional order, or whether other countries will emerge to be able to do that. Now, let's look at the actual situation, current situation with respect to internationalization of currencies. Is the Chinese currency, the renminbi, is it internationalized? No. There is a long-term plan on the part of the Chinese, arguably, apparently, to give it a bigger international role, but it's very, very far from having that. And that's China's currency. Forget about the Indian rupee, forget about the Russian ruble, forget about the South African rand. So we're very, very, very far from a situation where there could be an alternative unit. Paulo's proposal featured a trade-backed unit of some kind, but trade would also have to expand in a way between the countries in question in order to sustain that possibility. So I think, again, the impulse to create alternatives is very understandable. The power of that discourse is very understandable, but as political economists, we have to be realistic in understanding and thinking about these questions and where we are currently. This brings me to Frutuzo's question. Teresa and I had a little bilateral discussion about that. I'm sure she'll say more about it. But the U.S. is in a position to pay off its debtors in its own currency, right? And this is the little kernel of truth in so-called modern monetary theory, that the U.S. is in a special position in that regard, which other countries aren't. So whether or not a technical default were ever to occur because of lack of agreement between parties in Congress, which is also seems unlikely for game theoretic reasons. They have very strong reasons to in the end agree, even if it's a last-minute agreement in these situations. That's really the ultimate guarantor for the moment, in the medium term at least, of U.S. Solvency, right? And good faith and credit. So again, not so much reason to worry from that standpoint, seems to me. Finally, well, without denying the long-term issues, right? And that's why, by the way, why if you look at the yield curve, there are very different bets now being made about long-term U.S. bonds than short-term, short maturity bonds, because that's where the issues of faith and credit potentially arise. Finally, and let me take these two questions together on Karthik and Jill's questions, which I think are related for the reasons that Paulo mentioned. There is a vacuum of ideas, clearly, right, in the mainstream party left, let's call it liberal left, Democratic Party. There certainly could be more imaginative proposals. Maybe there were imaginative proposals, as Paulo says, that didn't somehow out because of the nature of the political process. Roberto Unger used to refer to the social democratic parties, especially those like New Labour and the New Democrats, as offering neoliberalism with a 50% discount. Right? So maybe now we have bastard neoliberalism with a 50% discount. Little bit of tariffs, a few tax cuts here and there, but not that much difference. Intellectuals were referred to. This reminds me of this wonderful line from arch conservative. I think it was Irving Kristol. Irving is the father of William, right? Who I believe is alleged to have referred to intellectuals. This is a very right-wing point, as the scum that floats along on top of the deep river of production. Okay. So I don't want to agree with that, but I want to take this metaphor of the deep river of production and just discuss that a little bit. I was impressed during the pandemic how much production continued and how little supply disruption there was, even in a situation where it seemed that everything had been shut down, right? And so I think we have to be, be very conscious of that in thinking about some of these policy changes that are proposed by the different parties. How much difference they're going to make in the near term to inflation or to availability of particular goods is really in question. But again, in the longer term, it could be a very, very different story. And I think the economic impact of the war on Gaza relates to that as well. It's been very little, right? Certainly for the United States. Yes, there's geopolitical risk that's emerged. Energy prices, oil prices in particular, have gone up again somewhat. There has been a boom in the stock of Raytheon and General Dynamics, right? Maybe more propelled by Ukraine than Gaza, and so forth. But how much difference has it made to the deep river of production? Not so clear, right? Or consumption.
I want to talk about heterodox economics. I'm going to talk to Karthik. I'm going to talk to Lauren. We wrote a paper a while back. It was funded by the Hewlett Foundation, various authors, graduate students and professors. And we concluded that a lot of the prospects of heterodox economics was that it wasn't all that good. Many of the schools were narrow. They talked to each other. And it was really a call to action to be very, very good economists if you want to be a heterodox economist. Write crystal clear and produce where it will be read. We also pointed out that a lot of economics is transmitted not with BAs or PhDs, but among the one college class that every college student takes. 1 million people in the United States, at least, take one economics class. Heterodox economists write the best textbook. We did an analysis of the textbook market, and it's wide open. It is not a monopoly. A good textbook can break through at high school levels and community college levels. And we take our heterodox economics, as Lauren pointed out, to places that need economics, to labor unions, to popular places. So the heterodox economists need not cry that we're being suppressed by neoclassical economics. There's a lot of work for us to do. And I've dedicated 42 years of my life to make heterodox economics better and relevant and inclusive. On a grander vision, an economic framework, I always go back to answer all these questions about the Gaza war, about this policy, about migration. I go back to a framework that is normative, that an economic framework that embraces three things is the one that will produce, it will provide a deep river of production to lift everybody out of poverty. And that economic framework has these possibilities, these pillars. One is a framework that embraces solidarity, and I'll talk about what solidarity means. An economic framework that embraces subsidiarity, a term much more familiar with non-Americans, but it's a very important. I'm going to challenge you, Paulo, that we have to embrace subsidiarity. Thank you. And the other pillar of an economic framework that works is one that always gives a preferential option for the poor, whether the poor in your own neighborhood or the poor in the rest of the world. Solidarity means that we build a party. Really, Harris is really irrelevant to this, that we need political parties in a democracy, and we can be the Social Democratic Party of the United States. That is a Democratic Party, and this must be a party that rejects the agendas of billionaires and embraces the agenda of the working class in a way that it drifted away from that. Subsidiarity, Paulo, means that we all are world citizens, but we all are part of a micro group, and we need to make decisions in the things that that affect us. One good example is on our health and our reproductive rights. And the preferential option for the poor is seems easy, but it's not. It means that the World Bank is an institution that cares about production and democracy, but always judges its policies about whether or not it compresses, whether or not it's economic growth, but whether or not it brings the poor up closer to the middle. It has to do with our public spending, and it has to do, and I really am so grateful for Sanjay and Paulo being on this panel and lifting up our thoughts about the election and talking about the America's responsibility to the rest of the world. That's why you're invaluable on this panel. So that's my framework. Solidarity, subsidiarity, and the preferential option for the poor.